Jason Holt was no stranger to the quiet hum of the city at night. The warehouse, a looming concrete structure at the edge of town, was his kingdom during the graveyard shift. Although the job was dull, he appreciated the peace. His tasks were simple: monitor the security cameras, walk the perimeter, and occasionally fill out reports. Tonight, however, the thick rain hitting the windows and the low rumbles of thunder outside gave the night an eerie, unsettling vibe. But Jason was used to this. He'd worked the night shift for months and had gotten used to the occasional creaks and groans of the building settling into the night. The isolation was something he cherished. But then, around 1 a.m., as the wind howled and rain pelted the roof like nails, something broke the monotony. The security alarm blared, soft beeping that echoed eerily through the hollow hallways. Jason jumped, the chill in his spine growing as he dashed to the monitor. The sensor had tripped on the rear exit door. He thought it was a malfunction. Perhaps the heavy rain had triggered it. When he checked the live feed, the camera showed nothing but empty space. With a sigh of relief, he walked down the dim, narrow hallway leading to the rear door, shaking off the unease that crept up his spine. He reached the back door, pushed it open into the pitch-black alleyway, and glanced around. The rain had washed away any signs of movement, and the alley was as empty as he'd expected. He double-checked the lock mechanism. Nothing appeared off. Shrugging, he locked the door and returned to the security office to finish up the paperwork. Moments later, a loud, hollow thud echoed from deep within the warehouse. Jason's heart jumped into his throat as the hairs on his neck stood on end. Was it the wind? A box falling from a shelf? Or something more sinister? He stood still, listening, then ventured deeper into the building. The lights flickered, and the sound of the rain outside grew louder, making it even harder to hear anything further. As Jason rounded a corner, his heart stopped. The front door was wide open, and there were muddy puddles scattered across the floor. Someone had entered the building. Panic surged through him as he sprinted back to the security office, locked the door, and pressed the emergency button. When the police arrived, Jason relayed the events. They found a man hiding behind some crates in the storage area, a hammer in his hand. His eyes locked with Jason's, cold and vacant, as he was cuffed and led away. It was later revealed that the intruder had been high on multiple substances and could offer no explanation for his actions. The police were unsure whether he had intended to steal or worse. The memory of that night still haunted Jason, especially on rainy nights like this. The thought of that man staring at him from behind the crates lingered like a shadow in the back of his mind. Officer Lena Cross had been on the job long enough to know that most calls at 3 a.m. were just kids looking for trouble. So when dispatch notified her about trespassing teenagers at the old, dilapidated hospital, she wasn't worried. She'd dealt with this before. This particular building was notorious for attracting thrill seekers. It had been abandoned for over a decade, and stories of strange happenings only added to its appeal. This was her fourth visit to the hospital, and she expected it to be just like the others, kids running off when confronted by police. But tonight felt different. As Lena approached the building, she noticed something odd. There was a flashlight moving frantically in the second-story window. It wasn't the usual group of curious teens sneaking around. This looked different, urgent, erratic. Lena parked and, with flashlight in hand, entered the building. She called out, expecting to hear the sounds of giggling or rustling, but the silence was deafening. Her flashlight beam bounced off peeling walls and long-forgotten hospital beds. No response. The building seemed too quiet. She crept up the stairs, the air thick with dust. As she reached the top of the staircase, she heard a loud thud. Something had crashed on the second floor. Lena's pulse quickened as she followed the sound. Her flashlight illuminated an empty hallway, nothing more than cracked windows and decay. She called out once again, but there was no answer. She turned to leave but froze as she heard a door slam behind her. A cold chill ran down her spine. Lena ran down the hallway to the closed door. When she pushed it open, Her flashlight revealed two smoldering cigarette butts on the floor. They were still warm, confusion mixed with unease. Just then, she heard the heavy footsteps behind her. A figure in a dark coat stood at the far end of the hallway. Lena's heart skipped a beat. She moved quickly to the exit, but the figure followed, growing closer with every step. It was then she realized there was only one set of footprints. Backup arrived minutes later, but the figure had vanished, leaving behind only the lingering echo of footsteps. Lena later learned that two local teenagers had been reported missing around the same time. No one ever figured out if the man she had seen was connected, but the disappearance of those teens was never solved. Ryan Cole was the kind of guy who found solace in the monotony of his night shifts. Working at the gas station until the early hours of the morning wasn't ideal, but it paid the bills. The parking lot was usually empty, except for the occasional car stopping for fuel, and the dim lights from the pumps cast long shadows across the quiet lot. It wasn't glamorous, but it was peaceful. That was until one night in late December, when the weather outside turned violent. Snow and wind battered the building, and the night took on a heavy, oppressive silence. The gas station was eerily quiet, with only the dull hum of the refrigerators in the back. Ryan's shift had started just like any other, except the weather had made everything feel more isolated, more desolate. At around 1 a.m., a car pulled into the station. Ryan glanced outside, expecting another lone traveler braving the storm, but what he saw made his heart skip a beat. It was a faded, old SUV, parked under the pump, with its headlights off and no one inside. Strange, considering how cold it was and how the snow had piled up on the ground. He shrugged it off at first. Maybe they were just waiting for the storm to pass. But 10 minutes went by, and no one emerged. Ryan's unease started to grow. The gas station had a reputation for being one of those odd places people only stopped at when they were desperate, but it had never felt so wrong. He stepped outside, trying to make sense of the situation. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he approached the SUV. Looking inside, he saw no one. The car was empty. No bags, no belongings, nothing. The faint glow of the dashboard lights flickered, and for a moment, Ryan considered calling the police. But then he remembered he had other duties: cleaning, stocking, and making sure the store was ready for the morning. Turning back to head inside, Ryan was startled by a sudden, sharp noise, a thud coming from the back of the store. He froze in place, his pulse quickening. His first instinct was to dismiss it as the wind, but then he heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, almost as if someone was walking around the back corner of the building. Ryan's hands trembled as he walked cautiously toward the noise. When he reached the supply room, the air felt thick and heavy. His breath quickened, and every fiber of his being screamed that something was wrong. He moved closer, trying to peer through the dark room, when suddenly, there was a sharp knock at the front door. Ryan's heart pounded as he turned toward the front of the store. The knocking grew more insistent, faster, more frantic. He ran to the counter and peered through the small window, his eyes scanning the parking lot. The SUV was still there, but there was something different now. The air was heavier, charged with an almost oppressive presence. Then, as quickly as it had started, the knocking stopped. Ryan felt a chill run down his spine. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but he knew he couldn't. He had to be sure that whoever was outside was gone. He glanced around the store, then stepped outside to the rear parking lot. The snow was falling harder now, and everything seemed muffled under the thick blanket of white. Then he saw it. A figure, tall, cloaked, its face hidden under a dark hood, emerged from the shadows near the back of the building. It moved toward him slowly, deliberately. Ryan's heart raced as he turned on his heel and sprinted toward the front door, slamming it shut behind him. He quickly locked it, his breath shallow and rapid. His mind raced, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. The police arrived minutes later, but by the time they reached the station, the man was gone. They searched the premises, but found no sign of the mysterious figure. The SUV? Also gone. For days after, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that he had narrowly escaped something unnatural. The feeling of being watched never left him, and every time a storm rolled in, the same sense of dread washed over him. The mystery of that night remained unsolved, leaving Ryan with one unshakable question. Who or what had been in that snowstorm with him? Lucas Grant had never considered his job at Pizza Haven to be anything more than a way to earn some extra cash. A quiet, uneventful job that kept him busy after school. That was until the night he was sent on an unusual delivery. It wasn't the order itself that was odd, but the location. The address he was given led him deep into the woods, far away from the usual hustle of the city. Lucas had been to parts of town like this before. Remote, secluded, with strange, winding roads that seemed to stretch on forever. The night was cold, the kind of biting cold that made his breath hang in the air like mist. Snow covered the roads, and Lucas's car slipped and slid as he made his way deeper into the wilderness. His headlights flickered against the falling snow, barely illuminating the road ahead. The GPS led him down winding streets, past dark trees and abandoned houses, until it finally showed him that he had arrived. The address was odd. It pointed to an isolated clearing in the woods, with only a row of ancient trees surrounding it. There was no street sign, no lights, nothing to indicate a living neighborhood. But Lucas's phone confirmed that this was the correct spot, so he parked and got out, looking around uneasily. The air was thick with the sounds of the forest, but there was something else, a strange stillness, as if the entire world had paused. As he walked toward the clearing, Lucas's eyes caught a faint glow through the trees, a campfire, burning brightly despite the cold. The flickering light danced in the darkness, and Lucas could make out the shapes of several figures sitting around it. For a moment, he felt a surge of relief. Maybe it was just a group of people, a few college kids out here in the woods. He had delivered to odd places before, but this felt different. He approached the fire, the warm glow casting eerie shadows on the snow. The figures were seated in a circle, their faces obscured by the firelight. None of them spoke. The air felt charged, thick with an unnerving silence. Lucas was struck by the absence of sound. There were no cars, no laughter, no music, only the crackling of the fire. He stood awkwardly at the edge of the group, holding the pizza boxes. One of the figures stood up and walked toward him. It was a tall man with dark eyes, his face partially obscured by a hood. Without a word, he took the pizzas and handed them to another person. Lucas felt a knot tighten in his stomach as the group stared at him, their eyes unblinking. He tried to speak, to ask for payment, but no one answered. Instead, another figure stood up from the circle and walked toward him. The man's movements were slow, deliberate, and as he approached, Lucas noticed he was holding something long and sharp, like a hunting knife. Fear gripped Lucas's chest, and he quickly turned to leave. But as he walked back toward his car, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Two figures sprinted toward him from behind the trees, disappearing into the night. Lucas didn't hesitate. He bolted for his car, jumping inside and speeding off before he could even process what had just happened. The road back to the city felt like an eternity, his heart racing the entire way. When he finally made it back to the pizza shop, he was breathless, shaking with fear. He tried to tell his manager about what happened, but the words felt inadequate. The group, the man with the knife, the strange, suffocating atmosphere around the fire. The police were called to investigate, but when they arrived, the clearing was empty. The fire was out. The figures were gone. No trace of anyone had been left behind. To this day, Lucas refuses to Ethan Barnes had never liked the idea of driving through the woods late at night. The snow was falling thick and fast, and the roads were slick, covered in a deep layer of white powder. His headlights cut through the fog and the snow, casting long shadows on the trees as he made his way through the desolate road. It was nearly 2 a.m., and the town was fast asleep, leaving Ethan to navigate the empty streets. Tonight had already been a long shift. The roads were empty, the air heavy with the weight of the impending storm. The order he had picked up was the last one for the night, and it was just a few miles from the town center. But something about the directions felt wrong. As Ethan turned off the main road, he found himself on a narrow, winding gravel path. The houses grew sparse, and the trees closed in around him, leaving him feeling small, isolated. He checked the GPS again. It was directing him straight ahead, but the road was so quiet, so abandoned, that he felt a strange unease creeping up his spine. The street ended abruptly in front of a large, weathered house. It looked abandoned, its windows dark, its porch creaking under the weight of snow. Ethan parked the car, hesitating for a moment before grabbing the pizza bags. Something wasn't right. The whole area felt off. Too quiet, too still. He approached the door and knocked. A moment later, the door opened. A man in a worn winter jacket stood there, his face pale as if he had been out in the snow too long. "You got my order?" the man asked, his voice low, almost robotic. Ethan nodded, handing over the pizzas, but his gut told him something was wrong. There was a sense of urgency in the man's voice, a coldness that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "Just leave it there," the man said, motioning to the floor inside the house. Ethan hesitated, then decided it was better not to linger. He stepped back toward his car, but as he turned around, he noticed something strange. Another man, standing in the shadows of the porch, watching him. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there staring. Ethan's stomach dropped. Before he could react, the first man slammed the door shut, and Ethan, heart pounding, ran to his car. He turned the key in the ignition, but just as the engine started, the first man emerged from the house, walking swiftly toward him. The figure in the shadows stepped forward, this time holding something in his hand, something glinting in the moonlight. Without thinking, Ethan slammed the car into reverse and sped out of the driveway, his eyes never leaving the rearview mirror. The two figures were still standing there, watching him. He didn't stop until he was back in town, his hands shaking uncontrollably on the wheel. When the police investigated, they found the house empty. No one lived there. No records, no history of the address. It was as if the men had never existed. Ethan tried to forget that night, but every time he drives through the woods, the memory haunts him. The icy air, the shadows, the men who had no business being there. Natalie Reed had seen it all during her long hours working the night shift at the 24-hour drive-through restaurant. The endless hours were a blur of fast food bags, greasy kitchen floors, and the dull hum of the kitchen appliances. The late-night crowd was predictable: drunk college students, tired travelers, the occasional weirdo. But tonight, as the clock ticked closer to midnight, something in the air felt wrong. It was as if the town itself had gone silent, and she, alone in the restaurant, was the only one left awake to witness what was coming. At around 12:30 a.m., her shift took an unexpected turn. The cook had called in sick, leaving Natalie alone in the kitchen with just the drive-through window to monitor. It wasn't unusual for her to be the only one working during these hours, but tonight, the loneliness was starting to get to her. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, and the rain came down in sheets, making the night feel even more isolated. With no customers in sight, Natalie had time to clean, organize, and wonder why she'd ever decided to take the night shift. She was just finishing wiping down the stove when she heard the faint sound of footsteps echoing from the parking lot. It was strange. No one was supposed to be out there at this hour. The parking lot was empty, save for her car and the flickering lights above. She glanced out the window, thinking it might be a late-night customer, but all she saw was a shadowy figure standing at the front door, banging relentlessly against the glass. At first, Natalie thought it was just some confused late-night driver, lost or in a hurry, but when she walked up to the door and shouted, there was no response. The man just stared back at her, his face obscured by the glass. She raised an eyebrow and gestured to the closed sign, but he did not acknowledge her. He simply stood there, his eyes fixed on hers. Confused and a little unnerved, Natalie turned back to the kitchen, hoping he would just go away. She continued working, glancing up now and then to check if he had left. But when she went back to check after about 20 minutes, he was still there, standing motionless, staring directly at the door. His face, now more visible in the dim light, was pale and unnervingly calm, almost as if he were waiting for her to open the door. His eyes, dark and empty, didn't blink. Nervous now, she moved to the back of the restaurant, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. Her heart pounded as she tried to make sense of the situation. Why wouldn't he leave? It wasn't until the loud bang from the front door, followed by the creak of the hinges, that she realized he had started to push against it. The door was locked, but the violent force of his attempts to open it sent a shudder through her body. She could feel the tension in the air thickening, the silence growing suffocating. Then, the footsteps moved, rapid, quick steps coming from the back of the restaurant. They were heading directly toward the kitchen. Panic set in as Natalie realized there was no one else there to help her. She reached for the phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. Before she could react, the sound of a door slamming shut behind her froze her in place. She spun around, only to see a dark figure standing at the kitchen doorway, staring at her. The man had followed her, somehow managing to get inside. She didn't wait to see if he would move. She ran for the back door, her heart racing, her breath catching in her throat. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to get out of the restaurant before it was too late. As she reached the back door, she slammed it open and dashed into the parking lot, her car in sight. She quickly jumped in, locked the doors, and called the police as she drove away, watching in her rearview mirror as the figure stood motionless in the doorway, watching her drive off. The police arrived shortly after she left, but when they searched the restaurant, the man was gone. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of anything amiss inside the building. The only thing they found were faint shoe prints near the kitchen, leading up to the door. And the strangest thing, there was no record of the man anywhere. No identification, no CCTV footage, nothing. Natalie never worked the overnight shift again after that night. The memory of the man's unblinking stare haunted her, a silent witness to the terror she had narrowly escaped. Matthew Hall had always preferred the quiet of the night shift. The hours passed by slowly, but the solitude of the store gave him a sense of peace that he couldn't find during the day. He could organize, clean, and restock the shelves at his own pace without the pressure of customers or rush hour traffic. It was a job he had grown accustomed to, a routine he could rely on. But on one particular night, the silence of the store was broken by an unsettling encounter that would change everything. It was nearing 3 a.m. when Matthew noticed something unusual. A soft knock echoed from the front door. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but when the knock came again, louder this time, he walked up to the door to see who it was. A man stood there, hooded and wearing a dark jacket. Matthew could barely make out his face, but what struck him was the man's intense gaze. His eyes locked onto Matthew's with unnerving focus. Matthew tried to ignore the feeling creeping up his spine as he gestured to the closed sign on the door. "We're closed," he called out, but the man didn't respond. He simply stared at Matthew, unmoving. After a few seconds, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Matthew thought nothing more of it, chalking it up to an odd late-night encounter. But as the night wore on, something felt off. The usual peace of the store had been replaced with a strange tension, an unease that seemed to settle into the air. Matthew continued with his tasks, trying to shake the feeling, but when he walked down one of the aisles to grab more supplies, he froze. A figure was walking past the shelves at the far end of the store. It was the same man from earlier. Matthew's heart skipped a beat. How had he gotten in? He glanced around but saw no one else in the store. He took a cautious step forward, trying to stay out of sight. The man didn't seem to notice him, but his movements were deliberate, slow. He walked along the aisles, stopping occasionally to touch items on the shelves, but never speaking. It was as if he was waiting for Matthew to approach him. The silence between them was suffocating. Matthew tried to move, but his legs felt like lead. The man turned and started walking toward the back of the store, and Matthew, unable to control his fear, followed from a distance, keeping to the shadows. When the man reached the back hallway, Matthew's breath caught in his throat. The man stopped in front of the office door, staring at it. Then, without warning, he reached for the handle and twisted it. Matthew's panic surged as he rushed forward, grabbing the man's shoulder and spinning him around. But the man didn't fight back. He simply looked at Matthew with cold, emotionless eyes. Matthew backed away, his heart racing, and reached for his phone. But as he dialed 911, the man stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. The police arrived a short while later, but the man was gone. They found no sign of forced entry and no traces of him anywhere in the store. The only clue they had was a strange, unsettling message on the store's back door. "I see you." Matthew never returned to the overnight shift. The store, once a place of comfort, now held an unspeakable terror that clung to every corner. Eric Grant had always found something almost poetic in the stillness of the night shift. The streets were empty, the world asleep, and he could cruise through the city without the usual hustle of daylight traffic. But tonight, as the clock hit 2 a.m. and a torrential downpour began, something felt different. The usual calm had been replaced by an almost oppressive weight in the air. His phone pinged with a delivery request, nothing too out of the ordinary. A typical order for tacos from a house just a few miles away. It was a standard order, but as Eric drove through the streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The rain slammed against his windshield, blurring the world outside into an indistinct smear of lights and shadow. His headlights cut through the storm like a knife, illuminating the road ahead. But all he could see were empty streets and the occasional flicker of neon from distant convenience stores. As he reached the address, the GPS led him down an unfamiliar road, a narrow street he hadn't noticed before. The houses here were spaced further apart, tucked away behind overgrown hedges. The streetlights were dim, barely cutting through the thick fog that rolled in from the nearby hills. Eric slowed down, unsure if he was heading in the right direction. When the GPS signaled that he had arrived, Eric paused. There was no sign of life here. No cars in the driveway, no lights in the windows. The house stood at the end of a long, winding path, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to lean in closer as if trying to block out the world. A faint, eerie glow flickered from the interior, casting long shadows against the snow-covered lawn. Shaking off the uneasy feeling gnawing at him, Eric parked the car and grabbed the food bags. The moment he stepped out of the car, a cold gust of wind slapped his face, and the rain hit him like icy needles. The crunch of his boots on the snow seemed too loud in the otherwise silent air. As he walked up the driveway, his heart began to race. The house felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. The closer he got, the more disorienting the silence became. He knocked on the door, waiting for a response, but none came. He knocked again, louder this time, still no reply. The rain continued to pour down, and the glow from the windows seemed to flicker with an unnatural rhythm. There was something unsettling about it, too faint to be comforting, yet too deliberate to be natural. "Hello," Eric called out, his voice shaking slightly in the cold. "I've got your order here." The door creaked open just a crack, and a voice called from the darkness inside. "Leave it at the door." Eric froze. The voice was low, but there was a distinct edge of urgency to it, a quiet desperation that sent a shiver down his spine. Still, he did as instructed, placing the bags on the porch. Before he could turn to leave, the door swung open wider, revealing only shadows inside. "Come inside," the voice said again, this time softer but insistent. "Just for a minute." Eric hesitated. There was something deeply wrong about the request, a sensation that something dark was lurking just behind the door. He didn't want to go inside, but curiosity, or maybe just the need to escape the storm, urged him to take a step forward. "No," he said, his voice trembling now. "I need to get back to work." But before he could retreat, the door slammed shut, and a figure emerged from the shadows. A man, tall and gaunt, with dark eyes that seemed to gleam unnaturally in the dim light. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his movements were stiff, robotic. He stepped forward, too quickly, and before Eric could react, the man grabbed his arm. Eric jerked away, his heart pounding in his chest as he stumbled back toward his car. The man didn't follow. He simply stood in the doorway, watching with that same empty stare. Eric fumbled with his keys, hands shaking as he climbed back into his car, slamming the door behind him. He looked up just in time to see the man disappear into the shadows of the house. He sped off, his pulse hammering in his ears, the image of the man's eyes haunting him even as he drove. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror, he swore he saw a shadow move across the window of the house. Eric floored the gas pedal, desperate to put miles between himself and whatever had been waiting for him there. When he got back to the restaurant, his hands were still trembling, and his stomach churned with a nauseating sense of dread. He told his manager what had happened, but the manager just shrugged it off, assuming it was some kind of prank. The address, however, wasn't on the delivery logs, and when the restaurant tried to call the number listed for the order, it went straight to voicemail. No one had ordered the food, and the house was registered under no name at all. The entire incident was a blur of confusion and fear, and it would stay with Eric for the rest of his life. Every time he drove down that road, he could feel the weight of eyes watching him from the trees. Every storm that rolled in brought with it the sound of rain tapping against his windshield, and the memory of the door that swung open to reveal nothing but shadows. Adam Parker had always found comfort in the steady hum of the night shift. There was something calming about being alone in the store, surrounded by rows of brightly lit shelves filled with snacks and beverages. The outside world faded away as he refilled aisles and stocked shelves. For hours at a time, Adam found solace in the predictable, monotonous tasks. But tonight, something had changed. It was nearing 2:30 a.m. when the knock came. A soft rap at the front door, almost too quiet to hear. Adam glanced up, unsure of who would be out this late on such a quiet, desolate stretch of highway. Most of the trucks had stopped coming through, and the roads were empty. He stood still for a moment, listening intently. Then the knock came again, louder, more insistent. Adam's heartbeat quickened. The store was closed, and the sign on the door clearly indicated it. He walked toward the front, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Peering through the glass, he saw a man standing just outside, staring at the door. His face was shadowed, his features obscured by the dim light outside. Adam stepped back, feeling a cold shiver run down his spine. He opened the door slightly, keeping the security chain in place. "Sorry, we're closed," he said firmly. "Come back during business hours." But the man didn't respond. Instead, he simply stared at Adam with wide, unblinking eyes. Adam felt a coldness seep into the room, a strange weight in the air that made it hard to breathe. The man was dressed in dark clothing, and his posture was rigid, unnaturally still. "Can I help you with something?" Adam asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man didn't speak. He just stood there, unmoving, eyes locked on Adam. It was as if time had frozen. A chill ran down Adam's spine, and he instinctively began to close the door. But before he could, the man stepped forward, his face now inches from the glass. The coldness in his eyes was chilling, and the air around him seemed to grow colder still. Adam backed away, slamming the door shut and bolting it quickly. He turned to the security monitor, but when he checked the cameras, the man was gone. The parking lot was empty. Adam's confusion deepened, and the unsettling feeling that had started in the pit of his stomach began to grow. He decided to leave for the night, but as he passed the back room, he froze. A dark figure stood in the shadows, just beyond the doorway. Adam's blood ran cold as he recognized the same man from outside. He had no idea how he'd gotten in, but there he was, standing silently, watching. In a blind panic, Adam turned and fled, locking the door behind him. The last thing he saw before he ran out the back exit was the man's face, staring from the darkness, his hollow eyes still following. When the police arrived, they found no sign of the man. The store had no security breach, no signs of forced entry. The only thing they found was the unsettling footage of the man standing outside. His eerie stare locked onto the camera. Adam never returned to work the night shift again. Daniel Woods had always hated the feeling of isolation. As a delivery driver, his job often took him to remote places on the outskirts of town, but tonight, he found himself on a road he'd never traveled before. The snow was falling heavily, and the wind howled through the trees, making the night feel unnaturally cold and empty. The headlights of his car cut through the darkness, illuminating the snowy path ahead, but it felt like the road stretched on endlessly, with no sign of life anywhere. When he first received the delivery order at 11:45 p.m., he didn't think much of it. It was a typical late-night order, and the address didn't seem too far from the restaurant. However, as he drove further into the night, he began to feel an odd sense of unease. The town was far behind him now, and the road seemed to narrow, the trees growing thicker on either side. There were no streetlights, only the faint glow from his dashboard, casting an eerie light on the falling snow. The GPS was giving him strange instructions, leading him down a winding gravel road that seemed to go on forever. There were no signs, no other cars, and the world around him felt suffocating, like the forest itself was closing in on him. The deeper he went, the more disconnected he felt from the rest of the world. The silence was almost deafening, and the cold, damp air made it harder for him to breathe. Finally, the GPS beeped, signaling his arrival. He looked around, confused. There were no houses, no lights, just an empty stretch of road surrounded by dense trees. He slowed down, glancing at his phone again. The address was correct, but there was nothing here, nothing at all. At that moment, Daniel felt a sudden jolt of fear shoot through him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from the darkness of the woods. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he felt his heart pounding in his chest. With no other option, Daniel continued down the gravel road. His headlights revealed a dilapidated wooden cabin in the distance, barely visible through the thick snow and trees. It looked abandoned, weathered by time and neglect, yet it was the only structure on the road. He parked his car a few yards away from the cabin, deciding it was his only option. With a sense of dread creeping up his spine, he grabbed the pizza bags from the back seat and made his way to the porch. The door to the cabin was ajar, creaking slightly in the wind. Daniel knocked 3 times, but there was no answer. He knocked again, a little louder this time, but still no response. The silence seemed to swallow him whole as he waited. For a moment, Daniel wondered if he should just leave, but the customer had already paid online, and he didn't want to leave without completing the order. He pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside. The air inside the cabin was thick with dust, the smell of mold and mildew clinging to the walls. There was no one in sight, but the place was clearly lived in, not abandoned. The floor creaked under his feet as he ventured further into the dark hallway, the low light from his phone the only thing illuminating his way. He called out, "Hello? I've got your order." The house seemed frozen in time. The furniture was covered with old, faded sheets, and the walls were lined with pictures of unfamiliar people, none of whom looked familiar. The chill in the air seemed to deepen as he walked further inside. Daniel's footsteps echoed in the empty space, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him from the shadows. As he reached the kitchen, the sound of a door slamming shut behind him made his heart race. He spun around, expecting to see someone behind him, but the hallway was empty. The door that had slammed was the one leading to a basement. Panic gripped him, and his hand instinctively went to the phone in his pocket, ready to dial 911. Suddenly, he heard a whisper. It was barely audible, like a voice carried on the wind, but it was unmistakable. "Leave now." The voice was low, raspy, and filled with a terrifying urgency. Daniel froze, the blood draining from his face. He turned around, his eyes scanning the room, but there was nothing. No one, just the empty cabin, staring back at him with its dark, hollow eyes. Before he could move, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him, slow, deliberate, and too heavy to be his own. Daniel spun around, but again, there was nothing. The footsteps stopped. Silence followed. Suddenly, the front door slammed open, and in the dim light, Daniel saw a figure standing in the doorway. A tall, gaunt man in tattered clothes, his eyes wide and unblinking. He was smiling, a twisted, unnerving grin that stretched from ear to ear. "Leave now before it's too late," the man whispered, his voice shaking with something that seemed like both fear and excitement. The man stepped forward, his hands outstretched, but Daniel didn't wait to see what he wanted. Panic surged through him as he turned and bolted for the door, not looking back until he reached his car. The cold air hit him like a slap in the face as he jumped into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. His hands were trembling as he started the car and sped away from the cabin, his eyes locked on the rearview mirror. The figure was gone, but Daniel knew something had been in that house with him, something far worse than he could ever understand. He never spoke about the incident to anyone. The GPS log showed the address, but it led to nowhere. No trace of the house was found when the police investigated. It was as though it had never existed, just a lingering memory in the snow. And yet, every time Daniel drives past the edge of town and sees the dark outline of trees against the sky, he feels a cold chill run down his spine. The house, the man, will always be waiting, and no matter how far he runs, it will find him again. Sarah Miller was used to the quiet nights. She had been working the graveyard shift at the local drive-thru for almost a year, and the routine was familiar to her now. The streets outside were dark and empty, the only sound the occasional car pulling up for food. But tonight, there was something different about the stillness, a feeling of something being off. The night started like any other. The first few hours passed with little fanfare, just the usual orders, a few drunks looking for a late-night snack, and the soft hum of the drive-through speaker. By 2 a.m., Sarah had finished the bulk of her cleaning and was preparing to settle in for a long, quiet stretch. But then, the first order came through the speaker and everything changed. "Hey, we're here for the order. Can you open the window?" came the voice over the intercom. It was unusually low and flat, with an odd sense of urgency that Sarah couldn't quite place. Sarah glanced at the camera feed to see a dark sedan parked at the window. She moved toward the window, reaching to open it, when she froze. The car's windows were tinted so dark she couldn't see the occupants inside, but she could feel something unsettling about the stillness of the car. As she opened the window, the air seemed to grow colder, and the streetlights flickered above. "Can I take your payment?" Sarah asked, trying to ignore the uncomfortable sensation creeping over her. No response. She repeated the question, this time louder. Still no response. Unease began to grow inside her. Sarah stepped closer to the window, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hello?" she called out. But there was still nothing, just the faint sound of a breath in the car, almost too quiet to hear. Her instincts screamed at her to close the window and walk away, but something kept her standing there. It was as if an invisible force was keeping her rooted to the spot. Suddenly, the passenger side window rolled down, just a crack. A pale hand, trembling, reached out toward her, holding a crumpled bill. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and the hand recoiled back into the darkness of the car. She quickly grabbed the bill, not daring to look into the car any longer. But as she turned to walk back inside, she felt it. A chill, as if someone was standing right behind her, breathing down her neck. Turning, she saw nothing. The car had vanished into the night. The rest of the shift passed uneventfully, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Every time she glanced out the window, she swore she could see shadows moving in the dark, always just out of sight. The next morning, when her shift ended, Sarah was still shaken. She walked out of the restaurant to her car, but when she opened the door, a cold gust of wind hit her, carrying with it the faint sound of a whisper. "I'll be back." Olivia Carter had always enjoyed the quiet, solitary nights on the road. As a food delivery driver, she often found herself driving through the empty streets of her quiet town after dark. The peace of the night was something she had grown used to. The rhythmic hum of her car on the asphalt, the occasional streetlight casting long shadows across the road, and the soft glow of her headlights cutting through the dark. It was an odd sense of comfort, knowing that the world was asleep and she had the roads all to herself. But tonight, something was different. It was nearing 1 a.m. when Olivia received an order through her Postmates app. It was from a customer who lived on the outskirts of town, an area she wasn't very familiar with. She checked the address. A long, remote stretch of road near the forest. There were no houses nearby, and the only landmark was a rundown gas station she had passed many times. It seemed odd, but the pay was good, and Olivia needed the work. She set off, the road growing emptier with every mile. The thick trees on either side of the road seemed to close in, blocking out the few remaining stars in the sky. The air was heavy with mist, and a low fog rolled over the pavement, adding to the eerie atmosphere. As she drove deeper into the woods, the GPS led her onto a narrow gravel path. The headlights of her car barely pierced the thick fog ahead, and the road became increasingly treacherous, the tires crunching over loose stones. There was no turning back now. The further Olivia drove, the more disconnected she felt from the rest of the world. Her phone signal was weak, flickering in and out, and the GPS seemed to glitch occasionally, sending her down paths that weren't on the map. She began to feel an uncomfortable sense of being watched, an unease creeping up her spine as the trees loomed taller around her, their branches twisting like outstretched arms. The silence of the woods was deafening, broken only by the sound of her own breathing and the engine of her car. Then the road ended. Olivia's headlights fell upon an old, weather-beaten RV parked in the middle of the clearing. The dim light from the windows flickered, casting strange, distorted shadows across the ground. The place looked abandoned, overgrown with vines and weeds, as if it had been here for years. Yet there were lights on inside. Her stomach twisted. She glanced at the address again. This was it. Taking a deep breath, Olivia parked her car and grabbed the food bags. Her heart was hammering in her chest, the unease she had felt growing into something more tangible. She walked towards the RV, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. As she approached, she noticed the strange stillness of the place. There were no sounds of wildlife, no rustling of leaves. It felt like time had stopped. She knocked on the door, her knuckles tapping against the peeling wood. There was no answer at first, just the soft creak of the wind moving through the trees. Then, just as she was about to turn away, the door opened slightly. A figure appeared in the doorway, a man, his face hidden in shadow. His eyes gleamed with an unsettling light, too wide, too intense. He was tall, wearing a thick jacket, and he looked disheveled, as if he hadn't slept in days. "Are you the one who ordered?" Olivia asked, her voice shakier than she intended. The man nodded, his lips curling into a small, unsettling smile. He didn't speak, just gestured for her to come inside. The door was still ajar, and Olivia could feel the coldness of the night creeping in from the darkness behind him. The air inside the RV was stale, thick with the smell of something old and rotting. I really need to get going," Olivia said, holding out the food. The man didn't take it. Instead, he stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The door creaked shut behind her with a sense of finality. The interior of the RV was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small, flickering lamp in the corner. There were old, dusty blankets strewn across the floor, and the walls were covered in faded photographs. Images of people Olivia didn't recognize, some of them distorted or torn. It was as if the RV had been lived in for decades, yet it hadn't aged in the way one might expect. The air felt thick with something dark, something wrong. "Where are you?" Olivia asked, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in around her. "Where's the person who ordered the food?" The man didn't respond. He simply watched her with those unnerving eyes, his hands twitching by his sides. There was a strange glint in the air, something that made Olivia's skin crawl. Suddenly, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She wasn't alone. She turned quickly, her heart in her throat, as the sound of shuffling footsteps echoed from the back of the RV. A figure appeared in the doorway, another man, taller and more imposing than the first. His face was hidden beneath a hood, and he walked slowly toward her, his footsteps too deliberate. He stopped just short of her, his presence overwhelming. The first man spoke, his voice low and raspy, sending chills through Olivia's spine. "I told you, you're not meant to leave." Before Olivia could react, the man lunged toward her, grabbing her wrist with a force that made her gasp. Panic surged through her, her heart racing as she struggled to break free. But the second man stepped forward, his hand outstretched, blocking her path. The RV seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing tighter with each breath she took. The air was heavy, suffocating, and Olivia knew she had to get out. She fought back with everything she had, pushing past the first man and bolting for the door. Her legs felt like lead, but adrenaline kept her moving as she sprinted toward the exit. She reached the door and yanked it open, stumbling outside into the cold night. She didn't look back as she ran to her car, slamming the door behind her and starting the engine with trembling hands. Her heart was pounding in her ears as she sped down the gravel road, the headlights cutting through the fog. The RV faded into the distance, but Olivia knew that she would never forget the feeling of being watched by those dark, empty eyes. As she drove away, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a notification from Postmates. The customer had canceled the order just minutes after she had left. She never spoke about what happened that night, but every time she drove through that part of town, she could feel the memory of the RV looming in the distance, watching her from the shadows.